The heavy crystal vase shattered against the wall, inches from Mia's ear. She didn't flinch, she couldn't see the glass shards flying, but she felt the vibration through the floorboards. "Clean it up, you useless freak," a voice spat. It was Victor, the younger, spoiled nephew of the man who owned this fortress. Mia dropped to her knees, her fingers trembling as she searched the carpet. A jagged edge sliced deep into her palm. She didn't cry out. She squeezed her hand into a fist, hiding the blood dripping onto the white rug. She heard Victor's heavy breathing, the smell of expensive gin wafting off him. He raised a hand to strike, but the air in the room suddenly turned to ice. The heavy oak doors had swung open without a sound. A pair of hand-stitched leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the marble. Victor's breathing hitched. The room went so silent Mia could hear the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. This is the cost of living in a house built on bone and bullet shells. Mia had arrived here 6 months ago, a girl with sightless eyes and nowhere to go, hired to clean the rooms no one else was allowed to enter. She was supposed to be a ghost, a pair of hands that moved in the dark. She never expected to become the focal point of a war between a man who broke worlds and a family that broke people. If you want to know how a blind girl became the most protected person in the underworld, you have to look at the blood on the carpet and the man now standing over it. Mia's hand throbbed, the copper tang of her own blood filling her nose. She reached for another piece of glass, but a hand, calloused and massive, wrapped around her wrist. It wasn't Victor. The skin was cool, the grip firm but not crushing. "Up," a voice commanded. It was Julian Vane, the crime lord they called the Iron Architect. Mia stood, her head bowed, her sightless eyes fixed on the floor she had memorized by touch. Julian didn't let go of her wrist. He turned to Victor. Mia felt Julian's chest expand as he took a slow, measured breath. "The vase was Ming Dynasty, Victor," Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "But that is not why you are shaking." Julian pulled Mia closer. She could smell sandalwood and gun oil. He took her bleeding hand and held it up between him and his nephew. "I hired her because she sees more than you ever will," Julian whispered. Victor tried to stammer an excuse, his boots scuffing the floor as he backed away. She was being slow, uncle. She's a liability." Julian stepped over the broken glass. The sound of it grinding under his heel was like bone snapping. He reached out and gripped Victor's throat, slamming him against the wall where the vase had died. Mia stood frozen, her blood dripping steadily onto Julian's sleeve. "If you touch her again," Julian hissed, "you won't need eyes to see what I'll do to you." He dropped Victor, who collapsed into a coughing fit. Julian turned back to Mia, his hand returning to her waist. "Come. Your hand needs tending." He led her toward the private wing, leaving Victor trembling in the wreckage. In the private infirmary, the air smelled of antiseptic and lemon polish. Julian sat Mia on a leather chair and moved to the cabinet. She heard the clink of metal instruments. He didn't call a doctor. He took a seat in front of her, his knees brushing hers. "Give me your hand," he said. She extended it, her fingers twitching. He began to pick out the microscopic shards of glass with a pair of tweezers. His touch was clinical, efficient. Every time she winced, his movements slowed. "Why didn't you run?" he asked. Mia tilted her head toward his voice. "Where would I go, Mr. Vane? I know the distance from the kitchen to the cellar. I know the shape of your hallways. Outside, the world has no edges." Julian stopped. He looked at her eyes, clouded, silver, beautiful. He realized she wasn't hiding from Victor. She was surviving a world he had created. He applied a bandage, his thumb lingering on her palm. The intercom on the desk buzzed. "Sir, the Petrovs are at the gate. They say you have something that belongs to them." Julian's grip tightened on the bandage. He looked at the door, then back at Mia. "Stay here," he said, his voice returning to its iron core. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." He stood, the chair scraping the floor, and Mia heard the metallic slide of a handgun being checked. The locks on the infirmary door were heavy, 3 distinct clicks that echoed like a death knell. Mia sat in the silence, her bandaged hand resting in her lap. She counted her heartbeats, 300 before the first muffled boom shook the floor. It wasn't a knock. It was a breach. Downstairs, the roar of automatic fire chewed through the silence of the estate. Mia stood, her fingers trailing along the wall to find the heavy medical cabinet. She didn't have a gun, but she knew the weight of every glass bottle. She felt for the smooth, cold surface of a heavy oxygen tank. If they came for her, she would not be a victim. Julian moved through the foyer like a shadow. He didn't use the stairs. He used the service lift Mia had shown him was quieter. He emerged behind the two gunmen who were currently shredding his mahogany desk. Two muffled pops and they collapsed before they could see his face. But the house was crawling. The Petrovs hadn't come for money, they had come for the leverage Victor had promised them. Julian realized with a jolt of ice in his gut that Victor hadn't just bullied Mia, he had sold her. He had told the Petrovs that the Iron Architect had a weakness, a blind girl who cleaned his secrets. Julian raced back toward the private wing, his lungs burning. He rounded the corner just as Victor was sliding a master key into the infirmary door. Victor's face was bruised, his eyes wild. "She's the only way they let me live, Uncle," Victor screamed, seeing Julian. "They want the drive and they'll take her to get it." Julian didn't hesitate. He tackled Victor, the two of them crashing through the infirmary door as the lock gave way. Mia spun around, the oxygen tank gripped in her hands like a club. She heard the grunt of two men fighting, the wet thud of fists hitting flesh. She couldn't tell who was winning. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. A hand reached out and grabbed her ankle, pulling her down. It was Victor. He was crawling, trying to use her as a shield as Julian rose from the floor, his face a mask of blood and fury. "Don't move, Julian. I'll kill her," Victor yelled, pressing a shard of glass he'd kept in his pocket against Mia's throat. Julian froze. His gun was leveled at Victor's head, but the angle was too tight. The room was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. If you believe that Mia deserves to escape this den of monsters, hit the like button so her story reaches those who need to see the truth. Victor's hand was shaking so hard the glass nicked Mia's skin. A tiny bead of red ran down her neck. Julian lowered his gun an inch, his eyes never leaving Victor's. "Let her go, Victor. This isn't you. You're a coward, not a killer." Victor laughed, a high, jagged sound. "You made me this way. You treated me like a dog while you treated her like a queen." Julian took a slow step forward. "I treated her like a human being. Something you wouldn't understand." Mia felt the pressure of the glass increase. She didn't wait for Julian to save her. She leaned her head back, slamming it into Victor's nose with every ounce of strength she had. The sound of cartilage snapping filled the room. Victor shrieked, his grip loosening for a split second. Julian lunged. He didn't fire his gun. He grabbed Victor by the hair and threw him across the room into the medical cabinet. Glass shattered again, vials of saline and morphine raining down on Victor. Julian didn't look at his nephew. He grabbed Mia, pulling her into his chest, his heart hammering against her ear like a trapped bird. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. She shook her head, her fingers clutching his shirt. "The Petrovs," she whispered. "They're still in the house." Julian looked at the door. He could hear the heavy thud of boots in the hallway. There were at least 5 of them. He looked at Mia, then at the small ventilation duct in the corner of the room. "Can you crawl?" he asked. She nodded. "I know where it leads. The old laundry chute. It drops to the basement." Julian unscrewed the vent cover with his knife. He helped Mia inside. "Go. Don't stop until you feel the cold air of the stone floor. I'll be right behind you." Mia slid into the dark. For her, it was no different than the room, but the air was tighter, smelling of dust and old iron. She moved with a speed Julian couldn't match, her fingers reading the rivets in the metal like braille. Behind her, she heard the infirmary door explode. Gunfire erupted, short, disciplined bursts from Julian's weapon, answered by the chaotic roar of the Petrovs. She reached the drop and slid, the wind rushing past her ears until she hit a pile of soft linens. She waited, her heart in her throat. 1 minute. 2. Then a heavy thud beside her. "Julian." He was gasping, his hand clutching his side. "We have to move," he groaned. "The basement isn't safe." They moved through the subterranean tunnels, the walls damp and smelling of salt. Julian was leaning heavily on Mia now. She led him through the dark, her feet finding the path she had walked 1,000 times while the rest of the house slept. "Left here," she whispered. "There's a loose stone. It leads to the boathouse." They emerged into the night air, the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks. The boathouse was a shadow against the gray water. Julian slumped against the door, his face pale in the moonlight. "The keys, in the locker," he managed. Mia felt the lockers, finding the one with the dent in the corner. She grabbed the keys to the speedboat. But as she turned back to Julian, a bright spotlight cut through the dark, pinning them against the wood. A sleek black SUV sat on the pier above them. Petrov stood on the roof, a sniper rifle in his hand. "Vane, you're a hard man to kill," he yelled over the wind. "But the girl has to come with us. Victor already signed the papers. She's property of the Petrov syndicate now." Julian tried to stand, but his legs gave out. He looked at Mia, his eyes filled with a pain that had nothing to do with his wound. "Run, Mia," he whispered. "Take the boat. Go." Mia looked toward the light she couldn't see. She felt the heavy keys in her hand. Then she looked at Julian. She didn't run. She stepped in front of him, blocking the spotlight with her body. "I am not property," she screamed into the wind. "If you think Julian will risk everything to keep Mia from the Petrovs, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story matters." Petrov laughed, the sound echoing off the water. "Property doesn't get a vote, sweetheart. Victor traded you for his life. Fair deal." Julian's fingers brushed the gravel, searching for his dropped weapon. Mia felt his movement. She knew he was going to try a suicide charge. She reached down and gripped his hand, stopping him. "Mr. Vane," she whispered. "The pier. It's held up by old cedar pilings, isn't it?" Julian blinked, the fog of blood loss clearing for a second. "Yes. Why?" Mia looked up at the sound of the SUV's engine idling. "I've spent 6 months cleaning the underside of that pier. The wood is rotted. And there's a gas line for the boat heaters right under where they're parked." Julian's eyes widened. He looked at the pier, then at the flare gun tucked into the boat's emergency kit 3 feet away. "Mia, if I miss." She squeezed his hand. "You won't." Julian lunged for the kit, his fingers clawing at the plastic. Petrov saw the movement and fired. The bullet barked against the boathouse, with splinters spraying Mia's face. Julian rolled, the flare gun in his hand. He didn't aim at Petrov. He aimed at the dark shadows beneath the SUV. A streak of brilliant red light tore through the night. The explosion was deafening. The gas line ignited, a pillar of fire erupting through the rotted wood of the pier. The SUV tilted, the rear wheels spinning in the air before the entire structure collapsed into the sea. A secondary explosion from the car's fuel tank sent a shockwave that knocked Mia and Julian backward. The screams of the Petrovs were drowned out by the hiss of fire hitting cold water. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the lapping of waves. Julian crawled toward Mia, pulling her into the shelter of his arms. They watched the orange glow fade into the dark. 2 days later, the Vane estate was a tomb. The police had come and gone, taking Victor in handcuffs and leaving Julian to nurse his wounds in the private wing. Mia sat by his bed, her hand in his. The house felt different now, larger, emptier but safe. Julian sat up, the bandages around his chest stark against his tan skin. "I'm leaving, Mia," he said quietly. "This life, it almost cost you everything. I'm liquidating. We're going somewhere where no one knows the name Vane." Mia smiled, her silver eyes catching the morning light. "I've already packed the kitchen knives," she said. Julian laughed, a genuine warm sound she had never heard before. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I never asked," he said. "How did you know exactly where the gas line was?" Mia leaned in, her voice a playful whisper. "I'm blind, Julian. I'm not deaf. The hum of the gas is the loudest thing in the boathouse." Julian shook his head, a look of pure wonder on his face. He realized that for the first time in his life he wasn't the one in control. And he didn't mind one bit. They walked out of the house together, Julian leaning on a cane and Mia leading the way. They didn't look back at the charred pier or the broken windows. They walked toward the car waiting at the gate. As Mia slid into the passenger seat, she felt the weight of a small velvet box in Julian's hand as he pressed it into hers. "Open it," he said. She felt the shape of a ring, the cold metal set with a stone she knew would be as clear as the life they were about to start. "Julian," she whispered. "Don't say a word," he replied. "Just keep leading the way. If this story broke your heart and put it back together again, hit the like button so I know to tell more stories like this." The car pulled away from the estate, the iron gates closing for the last time. Mia looked out the window, her sightless eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't need to see the road to know where she was going. For the first time, the world had no edges and she wasn't afraid. She felt Julian's hand cover hers, the ring a promise of a future where she would never have to hide in a pantry again. They drove into the sunrise, leaving the shadows behind. The gravel crunched under the tires of a nondescript sedan as they crossed the border into a coastal town 3 states away. Julian hadn't spoken for hours, his hand resting over Mia's on the center console. The air through the cracked window no longer smelled of wet concrete and industrial grease. It smelled of salt spray and blooming jasmine. "We're here," Julian whispered. He helped her out of the car, guiding her toward a porch that creaked with a friendly, weathered sound. He didn't lead her to a mansion. He led her to a cottage where the wind whistled through the eaves like a flute. Inside, the house felt small, intimate, and warm. Julian watched Mia as she immediately began to navigate the space, her fingertips dancing across the backs of armchairs and the edges of the wooden dining table. She stopped at the kitchen counter, her hands finding a bowl of fresh lemons. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. 7 steps from the door to the sink, she noted. The ceiling is low. It holds the heat. Julian leaned against the doorframe, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained, looking like a man who had finally put down a crushing weight. But the ghosts of the Vane Empire weren't finished with them. 2 weeks into their new life, the local news reported a mysterious fire at a warehouse back in the city, the last of Julian's holdings. That night, a black envelope was tucked under their windshield wiper. No name, no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid of their new cottage, taken from the treeline. Julian felt the old ice return to his veins. He didn't tell Mia, but she felt the change in the way his hand tensed when the floorboards creaked. "Julian," she said one evening, her voice cutting through the silence of the living room. "The man at the end of the driveway today. He wasn't a neighbor. His boots were too heavy and he didn't smell like the sea. He smelled like tobacco and cheap leather." Julian looked at her, stunned. He had been so focused on watching the horizon that he'd forgotten Mia heard the world in high definition. He realized then that the Iron Architect couldn't protect her by hiding. He had to finish the blueprint he'd started. "It's Victor," Julian rasped, his voice thick with a dark realization. "He didn't go to prison. He made a deal. He's hunting the one thing he thinks I value more than my life." He grabbed his coat, but Mia stood in front of the door. "He's not hunting you, Julian. He's hunting the girl he thinks is helpless." She reached into the kitchen drawer and pulled out the silver paring knife she had kept from the estate. "Let him come. This house isn't a fortress, but it's mine. And I know every inch of it in the dark." The shadows lengthened as a storm rolled in off the Atlantic. The power flickered once, then died, plunging the cottage into absolute blackness. Julian reached for his weapon, but Mia's hand found his in the dark. "Close your eyes, Julian," she whispered. "Trust me." Outside, the back door groaned as it was forced open. Heavy footsteps moved through the kitchen, cautious but arrogant. Victor's voice drifted through the house, jagged and high. "Uncle? I know you're in here. I just want what's mine. If you believe that the darkest rooms are where the strongest people are forged, hit the like button so Mia's light continues to shine." Victor moved toward the living room, his flashlight beam cutting through the air like a blade. He didn't see Julian, who was crouched behind the sofa, following Mia's silent hand signals. He didn't see Mia at all. She moved like a phantom, her bare feet silent on the rug she had memorized. As Victor passed the hallway, Mia reached out and swiped the flashlight from his hand, plunging him into a world he didn't understand. Victor panicked, firing blindly into the dark. The muzzle flash illuminated his terrified face for a split second before Mia tripped him with a heavy rug. He hit the floor hard, the air leaving his lungs in a wheeze. Julian was on him in an instant, the cold barrel of a gun pressing into Victor's temple. "You forgot one thing, Victor," Julian hissed. "In the dark, she's the one with the vision." Julian didn't pull the trigger. He didn't want more blood on their floor. Instead, he signaled to the local sheriff, a man he'd already paid a visit to the day the Polaroid arrived. The sirens echoed in the distance, blue and red lights reflecting off the wet windows. As the authorities dragged Victor away, Julian stood on the porch with Mia. The storm had passed, leaving the air clear and cold. Julian looked at the ring on her finger, then at the girl who had saved him twice. "I thought I was the architect," he said, his voice breaking. "But you're the one who built this life." Mia leaned her head on his shoulder, the silver paring knife finally put away. "We both built it, Julian. Now let's go inside. I think there's a draft in the kitchen we need to fix." They stepped back into the cottage, the door closing on the shadows of the past. The empire was gone, the money was scattered, and the names were forgotten. But in the quiet of the coastal night, Mia and Julian finally found the one thing no crime lord could ever buy. A home where the only things that moved in the dark were two people who had finally found their way. A year had passed, and the salt air had begun to heal the jagged edges of Julian's soul. The cottage was no longer a hiding place, it was a home. Mia had filled the windowsills with lavender and rosemary, plants she could identify by their scent long before she reached them. Julian had traded his tailored charcoal suits for linen shirts and grease-stained palms, spent mostly under the hood of a 1967 Mustang he was restoring in the garage. But the peace was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in their quiet cove, the low, synchronized hum of 3 black sedans idling at the end of the gravel drive. Julian didn't reach for his gun. He had buried it under the floorboards of the tool shed months ago. He stood on the porch, his heart sinking as the car doors opened in unison. It wasn't the police and it wasn't the Petrovs. Out of the lead car stepped a man with hair as white as the surf and a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. It was Silas Vane, Julian's father, the man who had built the empire Julian had tried to burn down. Silas looked at the modest cottage with a sneer of pure disgust. "You've grown soft, Julian," Silas barked, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Living in a shack with a servant girl while the Vane name is mocked in the city." Mia stepped out behind Julian, her hand finding the small of his back. She didn't need to see Silas to feel the toxicity radiating off him. He smelled of expensive tobacco and a coldness that made the summer air feel like midwinter. "She isn't a servant, father," Julian said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, low register Mia hadn't heard in a year. "She's my wife. And you're trespassing." Silas laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't come for a reunion. I came for the ledger. The real one. The one you didn't give the DA. The one that contains the offshore codes for the billion-dollar reserve." Julian felt Mia's fingers tighten on his shirt. They both knew the truth. The ledger Julian had destroyed was only half the story. The other half was stored in a place Silas could never reach, Mia's memory. She had spent months cleaning Silas's private vault before she ever met Julian, and she had unintentionally memorized the rhythmic clicks of the tumblers and the braille-like embossments on the cold storage drives. "There is no ledger, Silas," Mia said, stepping forward, her silver eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. "There is only a girl who remembers too much and a father who understands too little." Silas's eyes narrowed. He gestured to the armed men flanking him. "I have no desire to hurt you, girl, but that money is the blood of this family. If Julian won't give it to me, I'll take you back to the city and peel the codes from your mind one by one." Julian stepped in front of her, his shadow falling over her like a shield. "You'll have to kill me first." Silas sighed as if bored by the melodrama. "I was afraid you'd say that." He raised a hand, a signal for his men to advance, but a sharp click from the treeline froze everyone in place. From the shadows of the jasmine bushes emerged Rocco, his face scarred but his eyes clear. Behind him were half a dozen men Julian recognized, the ghosts of the old Vane guard who had been discarded by Silas years ago. "The Iron Architect always was better at math than you, Silas," Rocco grunted, his shotgun leveled at the lead sedan's fuel tank. "He didn't just build a house. He built a silent army." Julian looked at Rocco in shock. He hadn't known his old enforcer had been watching over them all this time. If you believe that loyalty is a debt that never expires, hit the like button so the Vane ghosts can finally find their peace. The standoff lasted an eternity. Silas looked from Julian to the armed men in the woods, realizing the tide had turned. He was a relic of an old world and Julian was the architect of a new one. "This isn't over, Julian," Silas hissed, retreating toward his car. "You can't hide from your blood forever." Julian watched as the sedans backed down the drive, the dust settling back onto the gravel. He turned to Rocco and nodded once, a silent thank you. Rocco tipped his cap and vanished back into the shadows, a guardian who asked for nothing in return. That night, Julian and Mia sat on the porch, the sound of the ocean the only witness to their conversation. "He'll come back," Julian whispered, his head in his hands. "He won't stop until he has that money." Mia took his hand and placed it over her heart. "Then we give it away, Julian. Not to the DA and not to Silas. We use the codes to fund the orphanages and the clinics the Vanes spent decades destroying. We turn the blood money into life." Julian looked at her, the moonlight reflecting in her sightless eyes. He realized then that she was the only one who truly saw the path forward. 1 month later, the news was filled with stories of anonymous donations, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars appearing in the accounts of struggling charities across the country. In a high-rise office in the city, Silas Vane stared at a computer screen showing his offshore accounts at zero. He had the power, he had the guns, and he had the name. But he had lost to a girl who moved in the dark and a son who had found the light. In the coastal cottage, the Mustang was finally finished. Julian turned the key, the engine roaring to life with a healthy, powerful growl. Mia sat in the passenger seat, her hair caught in the breeze. "Where to?" Julian asked. Mia smiled, her hand resting on the dashboard. "Somewhere with no edges, Julian. Just the road and the wind." They drove away from the cottage not as refugees but as explorers. The Vane Empire was finally dead, and in its place, something far more beautiful had begun to grow.